these three messages basically polarize the world into two groups. One group, the faithful, keep the commandments of God, including the fourth commandment or the commandment regarding the Sabbath. The other group break God's commandments and disobey the great Sabbath truth that we find in Scripture. One group receives, according to the Bible, the seal of God. That is, those who are obedient to God. And the other group receives the mark of the beast, which we've already studied, means knowingly keeping the first day of the week when very clearly you understand that the Sabbath is the day of rest. And so the Bible tells us that there will be two groups. The way that people respond to these three messages will determine which group they are in. Now, in Revelation chapter 14, these two groups are described as the harvest of the earth, that is the righteous, and on the other side are the grapes or the vintage of the earth, which represents the wicked. Now, it's important to notice that the righteous, according to Revelation 14, as we will study, are gathered inside the city of Jerusalem, whereas the wicked, or the grapes, are gathered outside the city of Jerusalem. Now, there's a very important principle that we need to understand in order to comprehend what we're going to study in our lecture today. And that is that in the book of Revelation, Babylon is not literal Babylon in the Middle East. Babylon is actually a spiritual, symbolic, worldwide system that is inimical to the people of God. On the other side, Jerusalem is not a literal city either. Jerusalem represents God's faithful people on a global scale who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus as well as the faith of Jesus. So in other words, Jerusalem is the place where God's people are gathered, but Jerusalem is symbolic or spiritual. Babylon is the place where the wicked are gathered, but Babylon needs to be understood in a spiritual and global or worldwide sense. Now, allow me to amplify this principle a little bit as we begin our study, because it's going to be foundational for what we study in the rest of the lecture. What I want us to understand now is what I call the law of the literal and the spiritual. And I'm going to illustrate it by talking about the garments that were worn by our first parents, Adam and Eve. The Bible tells us that God's garments are garments of light. In fact, the true church in Revelation 12 is represented as a woman who's clothed with the sun. When Jesus was transfigured, the Bible tells us that his garments became white as the light. In other words, Adam and Eve, in their state of innocence and righteousness, were clothed with literal robes of light. But those literal robes of light were symbolic. They represented their righteousness or their obedience to God. So in the Garden of Eden, we have the literal and we have that which the literal represents. The literal are the garments of light, real light that covered Adam and Eve, and the symbolic, or what that represents, is righteousness or obedience to God. Now we're told in Genesis that when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they were left literally or physically naked. And the Bible tells us that it was because they were disobedient to God, or now they were unrighteous. In other words, their nakedness, literal nakedness, also represented symbolically spiritual nakedness, unrighteousness, or disobedience to God.